Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker. Shame is debilitating. It ruins relationships, thwarts growth, and destroys hope. It can masquerade as various problems, guilt, envy, pride, resentment, but until you heal the core issue, freedom will remain out of reach. After 25 years of research, our next guest has discovered that sin is a response to shame, and once dealt with can bring remarkable transformation to even the most troubled among us. Dr. Mark Baker has a PhD in clinical psychology and a master's degree in theology, as well as a certificate in psychodynamic psychotherapy. He serves as the executive director of the Levi Counseling Centers in Pasadena and Santa Monica, California. He's the author of a number of books, including Jesus, the Greatest Therapist to Ever Live, with over 2 million copies in print, Spiritual Wisdom for a Happier Life, How Your 8 Key Emotions Can Work for You and You Can Change, Story from Angola Prison, and The Psychology of Personal Transformation. You can learn more at drmarkbaker.com. Joining us now, as he does on the second Friday of every month at the 12 o'clock hour, is the author of Overcoming Shame, Let Go of Others' Expectation, and Embrace God's Acceptance. It's our good friend, Dr. Mark Baker. Mark, so good to see you.
Eric, good to see you. This is an important time for us to be having these conversations.
One of the things that you and I committed to a long time ago was that we were going to be not only transparent with each other and in each other, but we were going to address the things that people are going through, needing help with, turning to artificial means for hiding, masking, covering, and not getting down to the root issue. And it's being fueled today by these measures to keep people away from other people.
Right.
And it's taken on a number of manifestations that are increasing. You see them clinically, but I'm hearing about a rise in opioid use skyrocketing.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it's not even logical. If I can't see somebody, how can I get to a dealer? How's he getting his opioids? How is this? And I got a call last night, and I was asked to make a visit to the psychiatry floor of a hospital here of a young man who I've known since he was a boy, who asked to see me because he had been having some psychotic issues, and he felt that the only person he could explain them to that would understand was somebody who had known him. And he talked about the fact that he invited a demon into his life in the 7th grade, and he remembers it. And so we kind of got to the root issue of how he was trying to deal with that, and Ouija boards, and then came the drug use, then came the alcohol use, then came he had been bouncing from family member to family member to family member to family member. And I referred him to a 7-month intake program that's run by very, very good friends of mine, and said this is the help he needs. He needs to get connected in an in-house program with people that he can worship with, he can be guided, mentored, and 7 months in residence program. And so the dad's making that call today to make that happen, to facilitate that. But as I heard the story, I began to realize that this is systemic.
Right.
And because we're socially distanced, the only ones we're encouraged to have contact with is immediate family. And so that dysfunction where there's been a divorce, so now you have 4 sets of grandparents. You have 2 moms, 2 dads, and all these people you can go to and take with you. So you're 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks, you're living in the basement and things aren't working out. So you call grandma and she says, well, you come stay with me. And the problem just keeps on recycling itself. And right. There is no recognition that the family should come together because they have built these walls because of the dysfunction that took place in the divorce and the poisonous fruit that was planted. As you and I both know, that even the new model of everybody knows it's not healthy to tear down your the child's mother, people still do it. It's chronic. They still do it. So when it becomes urgent and important to come together, they can't, right, because of these walls and this divide. So right. It leaves you almost helpless.
It's a serious problem. We're seeing now a spike in many serious areas of psychological problems as a result of social isolation. When we started off in this pandemic with the medical people telling us, oh, we need to socially isolate, and that became the thing, and we're wearing masks and we're staying apart. And here in California, we're only limited to so many people being together. Even Thanksgiving coming up, you can only have so many people in your house. We're going to keep the extended family away. I understand the importance physically of isolating this virus, physically, right? But tragically, in the beginning, the medical people jumped on the term social isolation. This is spiritually and emotionally damaging. It has always been toxic. We've known this for decades. The research surrounding isolation has been toxic. And they didn't think about that. There wasn't any thought about what's going to be the emotional impact of what we're doing. And still today, the advocates of social isolation are not taking into account the spiritual and emotional damage that they're advocating. And we're seeing now just this week, I saw all those things that you just mentioned. We have people coming to us talking about having inviting in spirit guides into their life. And what does that mean? They're trying to reach out and make some contact to some other being. They don't even know what that being is. And they're trying to invite that being into their life because they feel so isolated. We literally have a case of that this week. I have a case of a man who's divorced, and he has a son, and his son goes back and forth between his house and his mom's house. And in the mom's house, there's the mom, the grandmother, the aunt, 2 sisters, and the little boy, and they live in a neighborhood where there are only little girls in the neighborhood. This boy has no contact with any other males at all. So for the last year, that's been his life. They come to see his dad for every other weekend. And that's not much time compared to the rest of his life. He's cut off. Even he doesn't go to school, right? It's all Zoom. And now the little boy is saying to him, you know what? I think I'm a girl. And the dad's saying, well, it's because you're around girls all the time. That's all you see is girls. And just like you said, his mom doesn't tear him down, but his mom never says anything positive about the dad or other men. And so we're now seeing that problem. The dad is pulling his hair out, thinking, well, wait. I mean, this is just a little boy. How could he know what he is? Don't we think we should expose him? We can't. The government is telling us, no, the boy needs to be isolated. Well, what are we isolating him to? There's an environment there that's isolating him. So it complicates that picture. It's too early for us to tell what the suicide rate is now, because determining suicide takes time. They investigate it. It takes weeks, sometimes months to determine, well, okay, that was intentional suicide. So the suicide rates are fuzzy. But we do know is depression is up, anxiety is up, suicidal ideation is up. We know these things are happening. Marital conflict is up. Uh, we know and have always known that isolating human beings is not healthy to isolate human beings. So kids are now turning to social media more than they ever have before. And what we're finding is that the kids who use social media the most, of the extreme users, report the most social isolation. So it's counterintuitive. It's like, well, aren't they reaching out? Aren't they making friends? I mean, my kid has 700 friends, quote unquote, that he's. No, they're not. They're not his friends. Ask the kid himself, how do you feel? He'll say, I feel cut off. I don't feel my time is meaningful. I present someone on social media that I'm not really in real life. So his friends online are befriending is someone that doesn't exist. So how the kid himself feels is isolated, depressed, not living a meaningful life, not happy. He's angry and irritable. And so I think we need to have these honest conversations. Now, what I'm not advocating is that we don't listen to the CDC. I'm not saying that. I'm saying we shouldn't listen to any of the concerns about the virus. You and I both know people who have died from this. We've lost friends. Most of those are older. The percentage of deaths that are young is very, very, very small, and yet it's still lethal. This pandemic is lethal. But I don't want to take that away. What the CDC is saying, I want to add to it awareness and knowledge of the importance of connection. You and I believe that we are created beings. We are not an accident. It's not, we didn't get here accidentally, just merely by mutations. We are created with an intentional purpose to relate, first to God and then to others. If we are not taking seriously our ontological created status in life, we will result in problems, serious, serious problems. And we know that isolation is the source of many problems. We know that economists tell us that the major source of poverty in the world is isolation. Most people don't know this, but the poorest area in the United States is an area of white Americans living in the Appalachians. And why are they the poorest people in this country? Because they're isolated. They're not connected to any other community. There's no trade going back and forth. Their isolation creates their poverty. Those are the poorest economically people in our country. It's a group of white, very poor class Americans living in isolation. So we know economically, spiritually, physically, isolation is toxic for us. So if we have to distance, and I would say physically distance from each other to protect ourselves from this pandemic, what we need to not do is socially isolate. The social isolation is very, very damaging for us. We need to have honest conversations about how we're going to combat that. And simply letting your kid go into his room and be on his device is not a good enough solution. You think, well, he's relating, isn't he, to other kids? Well, maybe, maybe not. In the most extreme cases, it is not helping him feel connected. It is helping him defend against his need for connection with a fantasy that is not real. And so these conversations are hard. I believe there are solutions for us, but they're not simple. And I think we need to have spiritual and emotional conversations along with the physical conversations about how to deal with the pandemic that we're in today.
Mark, you have a unique experience that you may or may not have connected with all of this, and that was your experience at Angola.
Right.
Angola was a prison built around the concept of solitary confinement.
Right.
And solitary confinement is a punishment used in our prison system. It's a threat. that you'll leave the general population and be put into solitary confinement.
Right.
Now, in the penal system, we see the ravages of people coming out of solitary confinement, committing even more grievous and aggressive crimes against fellow prisoners, who wind up going back in or ultimately die in a prison yard conflict. And we've had a penal system built around the concept that solitary confinement, social distancing, is a form of punishment.
Right.
Now we take it and we're universally applying it as a panacea, when in reality, by design, it was a form of punishment, and still is a form of punishment in our penal system. So how do you reconcile in the penal system social distancing, solitary confinement, isolation is punitive,
Right.
and then you apply it to society and you do not expect the same result psychologically to the same impact of solitary confinement in a prison penal system?
It's amazing to me that no one has thought that thought. We know that if you take prisoners in prison and isolate them long enough, put them into solitary confinement long enough, they will actually start hallucinating. We've had that happen. That's how damaging it is to us psychologically, and that's why it's a punishment that everyone hates. Hell is not just the fiery pit. Hell is being cut off from God. Hell is isolation. Hell is where God is not. And we're creating hell for ourselves here on earth by advocating social isolation. We know that the root of being cut off from other people creates shame. I end up feeling bad about myself if I'm cut off from others. Shame is the result of isolation. If I'm cut off from others, I'm disconnected from others. It's a painful experience that, if it's forced, I then feel I lack value. If I don't have contact with you, you don't have contact with me, we eventually doubt our value in life, in existence. I need the bouncing off of other people to be reminded that I have value. If I don't have that over time, I doubt whether or not I have the value to even exist. You know, it's interesting that you bring up my experience in prison. I've spent quite a bit of time at the largest maximum security prison in the United States, and that's where my experiences there led to my book, You Can Change. And I was so impressed with what the inmates did there to create a culture of change within a maximum security prison where 95% of these guys never leave. They never leave. Talk about isolation. They're cut off from the rest of the world. And a small group of Christians there got together to create a community of life. They could create community within their isolation. And that community within the isolation is what saved them psychologically and spiritually. They found a home for their feelings, their pain, their anger, and they no longer felt isolated because they had each other. And the men who were put in solitary confinement. Now, the warden there for 20 years was brilliant in his understanding of what we need to rehabilitate. He saw that putting men in social isolation did not rehabilitate them. It punished them, and they hated it. And if that's all you did, they came out angry and more violent than before because they just felt punished and felt less human if you isolated them long enough. And so what he decided is, okay, if you commit crimes in here and you need to go to social isolation, we're going to put you in solitary confinement. But we're going to have one of these Christian ministers who are there in the prison, a Bible college educated minister, go and visit you in social isolation, in solitary confinement. So it was brilliant. They were in solitary confinement. They had no contact except a minister was a prison minister, and another inmate who himself was a minister, was allowed to go and visit them. And so when those guys came out, they were ready for change. They were ready. I have learned the value of connection with another spiritual being, someone who wanted to talk about my family and talk about what I did and talk about my concerns and get me a toothbrush if I didn't have one, or toilet paper if I didn't have that. Someone who cared about me in my isolation actually transformed these men. And so when they came out of solitary confinement, they were ready, not all of them, but some of them were ready to join the community of changed human beings. Isolation is toxic, it's damaging, it's a source of punishment. If we can't figure out how to be that kind of prison minister to each other now and reach out and make connections to each other, we're going to come out of this worse off than before we went into it. We're finding that the economic devastation that's going on now, the emotional devastation that's going on now, are creating, in some cases, larger problems than the pandemic itself. And so we need to start addressing these things. We already knew that suicide was on the rise before we went into the pandemic. We knew, especially among teenagers, the leading cause of death for kids aged 10 to 14 is suicide. And that was prior to the pandemic. When we come out of this and when we get the statistics out of this, I think we're all going to be very, very shocked at what damage that isolation is causing for us. And we need to take it seriously now. It's not too late. I think we can do some things now to address this issue.
There's a whole new realm of impact, and that is on the ministry. When you, first of all, oddly enough, surveys show that the profession of pastor is near the bottom of a survey of the most respected professions, just above car salesman.
Yeah.
Over 4,000 churches closed in America last year, and over 1,700 pastors leave the ministry every month. It's anticipated that 20 to 30% of churches in North America will close and not reopen, meaning the sanctuary, the house of worship, the person that was part of the glue in the community can't afford to survive financially because no meetings, no tithes, no offerings, no income, no salary. No, got to go find another way to make a living. It's now relegated to a vocation, a job, and it's impacted by this. And so you have some 500,000 pastors in the United States who are trying to navigate. And I can tell you, we're a ministry. We're trying to deal with the fact that we're off 70% in giving because our giving is in person. When I go out and speak, I have been out to speak since March the 15th in front of a group of people. So we have the faithful that continue to send in, but we're operating on 30% and trying to do what we did to reach more people, and we continue to, and we're working on new ways and innovative ways. But nevertheless, we're facing the reality of depleting resources. I can imagine the person that has a mortgage. You know, fortunately, we don't have a mortgage on the studio. We don't have a mortgage on the equipment. We don't have to make payments, but we have to pay for the broadcast services and for all these things that require. And so there's pressures there because we know how many people downline are impacted by this pandemic. So now you have the ministry, which is the, should it be the spiritual connection point? No, it should be a direct relationship with God. But the reality is, it is the spiritual community, it is the spiritual connection point, and it has been systematically unplugged. So now you have a whole new area of impact that's not even making any of the surveys. Nobody's talking about
Right.
people leaving ministry, suicides in ministry, moral failures in ministry, alcoholism, pornography, adultery, spousal abuse, all these things for ministers, because the lack of community
Right.
was also a fence that kept them corralled into this zone of in the Word, working with the Word, interacting with people, serving the needs of people. You pull them out of what is vital in their lives that brings them as much nourishment as it gives, and you cut off the life support. You've unplugged them. And that's 500,000 pastors in the United States alone.
This is a more serious problem than anyone is acknowledging. I just was reading this morning a study that came out of Harvard that is assessing religiosity, or they called it religiosity in cancer. And we've had these statistics for decades. But if you attend church, this is the only measure of religiosity they used was how often do you attend church? And so the people who attended church the most, which was twice a week or more, if you just go to church twice a week or more, you are 33% less likely to contract cancer. Now, that's just an amazing statistic. That's one of many. They also came up with statistics that determined you're much more likely to live longer. And the only measure they used was how often do you go to church? That was it. Didn't ask you how often you read the Bible or what your beliefs were, church or temple. They said, how often do you go? Now, their conclusion was, these are, of course, not Christian scientists, or scientists who are Christian, they're just researchers. Their conclusion is, we need that community. We need that social contact. Now, you and I know there's something else going on there that's miraculous. We go for an experience of God, but from the outside looking in, what they're saying is, wow, we're social beings. We need that. And there's nothing as powerful as getting together in a religious service. And one of the conclusions, not of that study, but of another study was, you will live longer even if you smoke, if you go to church twice a week. That it overrides the negative impact of smoking on a regular basis. That's how healthy it is. That's how good it is for us to be together, especially in a spiritual environment. Now these are just general health concerns. And we know this, and yet the government is telling us, no, you can't get together as a church. No, you can't. Churches, that's not essential. Yes, it is. It's actually essential for our physical well-being. And Byron Johnson in Texas has been doing research on crime and religion for decades. We know this research, that the most effective tool for reducing crime in the high crime areas, large city, inner cities in the United States, the most effective delivery system for preventing crime is the church.
Yes.
We know that the black church, if you are an adolescent in a high crime area in the United States and you attend church on a regular basis, you will not be involved in violent crime. You will not use illicit drugs. You will not get pregnant before you graduate high school. We know these statistics. The church is disseminating pro-social, healthy values that is changing lives and has been changing lives for decades. And sadly, not enough people are talking about the absolutely essential nature of the function that the church plays psychologically and physically in our lives today. We need this community. We need, everyone who's listening to us talk right now needs this conversation, and they need to realize, I've got to find a way to stay connected to my church community, my community of faith. My life depends on it.
No question about it.
We know this.
We're talking to Dr. Mark Baker, author of Overcoming Shame and a number of other books. He's got a new book coming out next year. You can find more about him at drmarkbaker.com. He appears with us on the second Friday of every month in the 12 o'clock hour, looking at the reality of life stimuli the need for community, how isolation fosters and feeds shame, which is at the root of sin, which means the more isolated, the more shamed, the more sin. So what's your response going to be to social distancing? You're going to turn to alcohol, or you're going to turn back to alcohol. We don't even have statistics on recovery who have now fallen back, addiction who have now fallen back. They don't have AA. They don't have NA. Zoom is no substitute for sitting in a room with other believers and somebody walking over and putting their arm around you and telling you they understand how hard it is to navigate it, but that you can do it. Just that single act of human touch, which is being removed, is proven. I'm living proof. 5 days in isolation after being born, I know exactly what it's like to have the absence of touch, that bond that for 69 years, my mother and I have acknowledged the fact that the bond between us is not a nurturing bond. It is she's my mother, I'm her son. That's primarily the extent of it. We love each other because that's what mothers and sons do, but we didn't bond. She had scarlet fever. We could not be together. And that's had a 69-year effect on that relationship that will never, it cannot be changed. And so we know that nurturing, we know that communication, we know that contact, all those things drive in the brain chemistry. We know all the physical and linked to the psychological responses, and we are fostering and hearing about the advancement of mandatory, across the board, extended periods of forced isolation. And what could be more punitive than 350 million Americans placed into solitary confinement? It doesn't work in the prison system. How is it going to work in America? You're talking about a recipe for anarchy. There's going to foster a rebellion where it's going to become so pent up and so violent that it's going to become explosive. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the things that we can do positively to foster healthy exchanges during this time, how we can continue to maintain even distant relationships by going deeper and connecting more transparently so that we have that system of safety, that safety net, so that we can confess our sins one to another, and God is faithful to forgive us our sins, but that does form a certain sense of community when socially we don't have it. And we're looking for solutions as to how we can manage in these very difficult times. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back. Shalom. I'm Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker, inviting you to join me and my special featured guests twice per month with Rabbi Zeb Parat and Carl Gallups, and monthly with Dr. Michael Heiser, Dr. Michael Lake, Dr. Timothy Jennings, Dr. Mark Baker, Dr. Jeffrey Johnson, Drs. Michelle and Mark Sherwood, Dr. Kim Moss, Derek Gilbert, Peter Rosenberger, Brandon Gallups, Steve Fair, Stephen Black, and Sean Tabbitt for in-depth insights into Israel, prophecy, the unseen realm, the brain, spiritual warfare, overcoming shame, mysteries of the Bible, prophetic insights, the sensational and the supernatural, caregiving, addiction recovery, understanding the divided heart, same-sex attraction, and much more. We're proud to feature some of the greatest biblical minds from both Israel and around the United States. Check out our featured guest lineup and 24/7 feed on ignitinganation.com or watch by topic on any device with our free apps. If you can't find what you need, you're just not looking in the right place. Follow us on social media and download our free apps today.
With today's smartphone technology, news, information, sports, and entertainment is widely available and almost unbounded. But what about the information that believers in Yeshua are looking for? Well, now there's an app for that. Igniting a Nation now has apps available for Android and iPhone. With our app, you'll gain access to everything you would in our website, from our featured guests to our live streaming shows. Visit Google Play or the Apple Store and download Igniting a Nation's new app today.
Shalom. I'm Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker, inviting you to join me and Israel's #1 rated guide, Edo Canaan, for our annual Israel trip. Our 2022 trip is now open for registration for our 18th trip to Israel. Our trip will take us from Tel Aviv to the Galilee, down to the Dead Sea, and 4 nights in Jerusalem. You will walk where Yeshua walked and watch the Bible turn from black and white to living color. Visit ignitinganation.com/events and download the registration form today. No, it's not too early to take advantage of our payment plan designed to fit any budget. All of our trips sell out, and we want you to experience this life-changing journey. Registration is now open for April 2nd to 13th, 2022, and we promise you, you will never read your Bible the same way again. Hello and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heart lines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker, and as we do on the second Friday of every month in the 12 o'clock Central Time hour, we meet with our good friend Dr. Mark Baker, author of numerous books, Overcoming Shame, Jesus, the Greatest Therapist Who Ever Lived, Spiritual Wisdom for a Happy Life, You Can Change, and a new book coming out next year. You can find more about him at drmarkbaker.com. Mark, welcome back.
Good to be with you.
Mark, we know that this is something that's going to have a lasting residual impact, and I'm sure that the lexicons or leprechauns or whoever keep the new library of phobias and new sets of diagnosis are adding new categories having to do with present PTSD, present traumatic stress syndrome, not post, present.
Right.
Traumatic stress syndrome.
Right. I think we're headed.
This is current.
This is happening to us right now. You don't have to go into your childhood to figure out why you're depressed or anxious. We see a spike in those emotions now because of what's going on now. This is not healthy for us to be disconnected. We've done research on the need for responsiveness from others. We need human responsiveness or we don't thrive. We know that when babies are born, if you don't pick them up and hold them, they develop what's called a failure to thrive syndrome and often die just because no one picked them up and held them. We decades ago thought, well, it was more sanitary to just not pick them up because, you know, we had all these people coming in and out of the nursery. They were orphans, so the nurses wouldn't pick them up, and they discovered they were dying because no one picked them up and held them. We know with the little bit older babies, around, say, year 1, we've done what we call the still face experiment. I think I've mentioned this to you before, but mothers bring in their babies, and this is on video, and the psychologist would say, okay, all I want you to do is just at some point in here, just stop having any expression. Just have your face there, but don't smile, don't frown, nothing. Just hold a still face. And they're videotaping this from outside the room. And within 90 seconds, the baby is screaming. because I'm not getting any interaction. The baby's used to when it does something, the mom does something. And when the baby makes a noise, the mom makes a noise. And all of us do that when we see a baby. We start talking like babies, you know. We somehow know that there needs to be a back and forth, a reciprocity to the human exchange that is real time human back and forth expressions. And if babies are deprived of that, they start screaming in pain because I'm not getting any back and forth with you. And a lot of that is nonverbal. A lot of that we pick up on cues, on body posture, on the way you're standing, where you're holding your head. And it's not verbal, obviously. 1-year-olds are not verbal, but there's a need for human action, interaction that very, very, very early on, it's hardwired into us. We know we need. And so look, fast forward here to age 40, 50, 60, we need that interaction. It is burned into the back of our brain. I need back and forth. Me just texting how I feel and somebody liking it, that's not back and forth. I need an exchange where there's reciprocity, where there's an exchange of human mirroring back and forth. We now know that the brain development is dependent upon emotional attunement. We didn't know that before. We thought it was cognitive development. It was all about what we're learning cognitively and statistically and developing the prefrontal cortex. We now know the brain won't develop unless it has emotional attunement, and machines can't give us that. So this is quite serious. We need to figure out how to provide that kind of attunement for each other in this environment right now, because this is traumatic. What we're going through, all of us now on the globe, we're going through a traumatic experience.
Are there a team of psychological professionals who are advising the talking heads, the Faucis, and the people that are policymakers who are in this area, who are saying that the long-term psychological impact will last far longer than the coronavirus? The coronavirus is a cold. It's out of the cold family. So the common cold in its first iteration was just as devastating as the coronavirus is today. So we know we're going to find a way. We haven't found a cure for the common cold. People still get them all the time, but we don't social distance for the common cold. We don't social distance for the flu. This is something unusual, and it's global, but there were many plagues and many pestilences that were global. Are they being advised? Is there a team from the psychological world that is saying, before you start implementing these policies, and they're being done at the state level, so I know that the governor of California is taking his policy positions from scientists, and all we hear about are scientists. We don't hear about psychologists. We don't hear about psychiatrists. We only hear about immunologists, and we only hear about virologists. We don't hear about the psychological impacts of this. Yeah, are there people who are a voice in bringing into this narrative and saying, you know, there could be an increase in COVID-19 infections, but when we're looking at the diminishing mortality rates among younger people, the answer becomes, okay, so what? If you're going to be sick for 7 to 10 days and you're not going to have a long-term psychological effect from it, is it better for you to get the COVID-19 virus and spend 7 to 10 days not feeling great and having no latent psychological long-term impact than it is for you to not get the COVID-19 virus and be socially stigmatized for the rest of your life?
The answer is yes. There are people in the field of psychology who are writing position papers and uh, they're trying to provide some input, but the topic has become politicized, and that's unfortunate. So if I were to say, well, let's talk about this. Maybe we do need to isolate older people. That sounds right because they're the ones who are dying. But what's the psychological and emotional long-term cost to teenagers who are being isolated? How are we damaging them in ways that it's going to severely affect the rest of their lives, where if they were to contract the virus, it would not? So can we have that sort of more balanced conversation with different age groups, different things need to be going on? That becomes very difficult because we tend to think in binary categories. Either I'm pro science and so we need to isolate, or I'm not pro science and we don't need to isolate. And we have these two artificial categories, and we can't dialogue and come to the middle and say, well, let's weigh the cost of benefits. Maybe people should be going to church and wearing masks, and they should be allowed to be together and 6 feet apart. But because the emotional, spiritual, psychological, physical benefits of being together outweigh the risks for certain age groups. I think that's a more nuanced conversation that's difficult to have in a political environment that's binary. You're either pro this candidate or pro that candidate, and there's no middle ground for conversation. That's become very, very difficult. There aren't a lot of people who are having balanced conversations like this, where you and I recognize, no, this is a more lethal virus than the flu to certain age groups. Certain age groups, it will kill you uh, to a higher degree than the flu. But the other age groups, it's not nearly as lethal as other things, like suicide. At age 10 to 14, suicide is more lethal than the coronavirus. So I think we need to take that seriously and have a more nuanced conversation. It's sadly it's not happening.
How did we get so skewed up that we took one science and elevated above all other sciences, which is not scientific at all? There's nothing scientific about ignoring physics when I'm studying you don't pull one of the pillars of science out to elevate another pillar of science. Science is the blend of the knowledge acquired, merged together into how to apply it, to implement it, and when we get into, and I understand there's quantifiable. I can do a swab and I can do a test. I can't do a schizophrenia. I can't do a bipolar. I can't do a personality disorder swab. And so that's a different science. That's a lesser science because I can't quantify it statistically because of it meeting these, it's subjective to your diagnostic capabilities. But we've seen to have glorified this one aspect of the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. What impact have they had on the opioid crisis? What impact have they had on pharmaceutical abuse? What impact have they had on cocaine usage? I mean, so if it's not viral, it's not important. If it's not, if you're looking at death, I would be looking at the Center for CDC, the Center for Death Control. What are the areas that cause death that are preventable? Well, number one would be abortion.
Right.
That's
far more deaths from that, right?
That's the leading preventable cause of death in the world.
Right.
So let's rename them for the Center of Death Control as opposed to Disease Control, and get them to start looking at the things that are killing people, and let us figure out these lesser issues, and maybe we'd get some good science and we'd get some more support for what you do, and more funding for what you do, and more research for what you do, and find some of these connection points that, wait a second, I can smoke and go to church and reverse the effects of smoking. I wonder if I can go to church and reverse the effects of COVID-19.
Exactly. Interesting thought. And sadly, I know the government has pumped a lot of money into our society to try to help with the financial devastation, the PPP loans and others. A very, very tiny percent of that money has gone to address mental health needs. It's so sad. They don't get this conversation, that there's a spiritual, emotional crisis going on. We're being traumatized spiritually and emotionally, that people need to reach out, need to find ways to stay connected. Okay, maybe physically we need to stay away from older people, or have them stay away from the general population, but we still need connection. We still need family gatherings. Thanksgiving is critical. Thanksgiving is psychologically, spiritually, and physically necessary for people to connect, to find ways of connecting. And I would say if using Zoom or Skype or virtual ways to connect is all you have right now, use it. Use it to have conversations, to talk about particularly how you're feeling. If you reach out to someone this week, don't just ask them what they did today. Ask them how they felt about what they did today. That creates connection. We can still do this, even in our limited and constrained environment. We can create a sense of bonding, which comes by focusing on spiritual and emotional content in our conversation. Have that in your mind, everyone who's listening, have this in your mind. When you're reaching out to others to make a phone call, it's because you want to find out how they feel and how they experience God today. Is there a spiritual and emotional connection? That will connect you even over the telephone line. So it doesn't have to be either or. It doesn't have to be, okay, I'm going to live in isolation because I'm afraid I'm going to die of the virus. No, you don't have to live in isolation. You can physically distance from people, but socially and spiritually connect with people. We can still do this. We've got to be very sophisticated in the way we do, and not make it a binary thing where I'm either pro-science or against science. No, I'm pro all of science, not just one little piece of it. And we have a lot of scientific evidence to support the centrality of spiritual community to our physical and emotional health. And we need to be aware of that reality as well, not just live in fear of having some virus that I can't see come and get me. Living in fear is a very damaging way to live, and fear is a terrible motivation for any decision you make in life.
Amen.
Love is a more powerful and a more effective motivator for making good choices. So whatever we do this week, make love your motivation, not fear, and you'll make a better choice. We know that. We know that.
Sound counsel from Dr. Mark Baker. Find out more about him at drmarkbaker.com. Get his books. You can get them by visiting ignitingnation.com. Click on a link. It'll take you right there to get all of his books, and you can join us on the second Friday of every month, the 12 o'clock hour, for what you'll find to be dynamic, honest, insightful, real conversation about the issues facing the body of Messiah and those who are impacted outside of it, that we hope that our witness will welcome them in to a comfort and to a peace that we have, that we know that God is sovereign and that the price has been paid for us, that this is temporary, it's uncomfortable, it is tribulation, nobody wants it, but faith, even as small as a mustard seed is 100 million times larger than the coronavirus germ. Think about that. Faith as small as a mustard seed is that much bigger than the coronavirus cell. Dr. Mark Baker, always a blessing to be with you. Always good to see you. I will see you again next month on the second Friday at 12 o'clock. God bless.
Thank you. God bless.
All right. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.